The cargo ship, named Distant Horizon, dropped out of hyperspace above a frozen world called Velcris 7, and Captain Daniel Shaw stood at the viewport, watching the ice storms swirl across the planet's surface like white serpents eating everything in their path. His co-pilot, Claire Mitchell, looked at her scanner screen, and her eyes went wide with surprise, because she was seeing something that should not be there. "I am picking up 2 life signs down there," she said in a confused voice. "They are very faint, but they are definitely alive." Daniel turned away from the window and walked over to look at the screen himself, and what he saw made no sense at all, because this planet had been abandoned 300 years ago, and nobody had come here since then. The Galactic Council had declared Velcris 7 too dangerous for any kind of settlement, and they had stopped all supply missions and rescue operations, and basically forgotten that this world even existed. "The equipment is working right?" Daniel asked. But even as he spoke the words, he could see that Claire was right, because the 2 life signs were blinking on the screen, clear as day. "They are in the northern part of the planet, inside some kind of building," Claire said, while she pulled up more information. "The temperature outside is -80 degrees, and it keeps getting colder every hour." Daniel had been flying cargo ships through the outer territories for 15 years, and in that time he had seen many things that the Galactic Council pretended did not exist, like forgotten colonies and abandoned space stations, an entire species of people who had been left to die because helping them was not profitable. It never felt right to him when he thought about all those beings who had suffered while the rest of the galaxy looked the other way. "Set a course for those coordinates," he said to Claire. "We are going down there." Claire did not argue with him. She had worked with Daniel long enough to recognize that tone in his voice, and she knew that once he made up his mind about something, he would not change it. The Distant Horizon began its descent through the thick atmosphere of Velcris 7, and the winds outside were so strong that they shook the entire ship like a toy being rattled by an angry child. The heating systems had to work as hard as they could just to keep the temperature inside the ship above freezing, and even then, Daniel could see frost forming on some of the interior walls. When they finally landed near the structure that the scanner had detected, Daniel could see that it was some kind of ancient temple that had been half buried under mountains of snow and ice. He put on his thermal suit, which was the heaviest and warmest gear he owned, and then he stepped outside into the frozen wasteland. The cold hit him like a punch to the chest, even through all his protective clothing. Not breathe, because the air was so bitter and harsh. He activated the lamp on his helmet and started walking toward the entrance of the temple. And every step he took made a loud crunching sound as his boots broke through layers of ice that had been building up for decades, or maybe even centuries. Inside the temple, everything was dark and completely silent, and frost covered every surface so thickly that the ancient carvings on the walls had become impossible to read or understand. Daniel followed the signal on his scanner, deeper into the building, going down corridors that became narrower and colder with each passing minute, until he was not sure if he would ever find his way back out again. And then he found them. 2 figures were lying huddled together in what looked like it might have been a ceremonial chamber long ago, and when Daniel shined his light on them, he had to stop and stare, because he had never seen anything like them before. They were reptilian creatures covered in scales that gave off a faint glow, even though the creatures themselves looked barely alive, and each one was at least 12 feet long, with powerful arms and legs, and ridged spines running down their backs. Dragons was the word that came into Daniel's mind, because that was the closest thing he could compare them to, even though he knew that real dragons were supposed to be just myths and legends. Their eyes were closed, and their breathing was so shallow that Daniel could barely tell they were breathing at all. And when he checked his scanner, he saw that their body temperatures had dropped to dangerously low levels. They were dying, and from the look of things, they had probably been dying for a very long time, just waiting for the cold to finally finish them off. Daniel knelt down beside the two creatures, and he felt something twist inside his chest, because nobody deserved to die like this, alone and forgotten in a frozen tomb. Galaxy went about its business. "Claire," he said into his communication device, "I need you to bring me emergency thermal blankets and the medical kit right now." "What did you find down there?" Claire asked, and Daniel could hear the concern in her voice. "I found two beings who need our help," he replied, "and I am not going to let them die." While he waited for Claire to arrive, Daniel did what he could to help the two creatures by brushing away the frost that had accumulated on their scales and checking their vital signs more carefully. The larger one of the two seemed to be in slightly better condition than the smaller one, but both of them were in very bad shape, and Daniel was not sure if they could be saved even with all the medical supplies on the ship. Claire arrived a few minutes later carrying everything Daniel had asked for, plus some extra heating packs that she had found in the storage compartment. Together, they wrapped the two creatures in thermal blankets and placed heating packs around their bodies and connected them to the portable medical monitor so they could track their vital signs. "Who are they?" Claire asked as she worked. "What are they doing here on a planet that has been abandoned for 300 years? "I do not know," Daniel admitted, "but we are going to find out." He looked down at the two beings lying before him, and he made a silent promise to them that he would not leave this planet until they were safe. The galaxy might have forgotten about them, but Daniel Shaw had found them, and that meant they were his responsibility now. He did not know yet that these two creatures were brothers, or that they were the last survivors of an ancient and noble species, or that their story would change the course of galactic history. All he knew was that they needed help, and he was the only one there to give it. And for Daniel that was enough. The larger of the two dragons woke up first, and his eyes snapped open to reveal brilliant amber irises with vertical pupils that seemed to glow in the dim light of the temple chamber. For a moment, Daniel thought that he was about to be attacked, because the creature looked powerful and dangerous, and he had no idea if these beings were friendly or hostile. But instead of attacking, the dragon simply stared at him with an expression that looked like confusion, as if he could not understand what he was seeing or why a strange creature was standing over him. "Easy there," Daniel said in a calm and gentle voice. "You are safe now, and I am not going to hurt you." The dragon did not respond right away, but his gaze shifted to look at his brother, who was still lying unconscious beneath a pile of thermal blankets. And something changed in his expression when he saw the smaller dragon. It was an expression that Daniel recognized immediately, even though it was on the face of an alien being. Expression of fear and desperation and love that any person would show when they saw someone they cared about in danger. "Does he live?" the dragon asked, and his voice was deep and powerful, but also rough, like he had not spoken in many years. "He is alive," Daniel replied, "but barely so, and he needs proper medical care that I cannot give him here." The dragon tried to stand up, but his legs were too weak, and they buckled beneath him. Daniel tried to catch him, but the creature weighed at least a ton, and there was no way a human could support that kind of weight. "My name is Daniel Shaw," he said as he helped the dragon settle back down. "I am a human, and I work as a cargo pilot, and I found your signal by accident while I was passing through this sector." The dragon let out a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. "There was no signal, because we stopped calling for help a long time ago, when we realized that nobody was ever going to answer." Several hours, while Daniel and Claire worked to stabilize both brothers and prepare them for transport to the ship, the larger dragon told them his story. His name was Korath, and his unconscious brother was called Venus. And they were the last living members of a species known as the Draconeth, who had once ruled over Velcris 7, when it was a warm and beautiful world full of life. 300 years ago, the sun that warmed their planet had begun to grow dim, which was a natural thing that happened every few thousand years. But the Draconeth had no way to survive without the heat that their sun provided. They had sent messages to the Galactic Council, begging for help, and asking for ships to come and take their people to a new world where they could start over and rebuild their civilization. But the Council had refused to help them. "We were told that we were not members of the Galactic Council," Korath explained, and his voice was heavy with grief that had been long endured. "Building for 3 centuries, they said we had no trade agreements and no political alliances, and therefore we were not their concern." So the Draconeth had been left to die slowly over generations as the cold crept across their world and killed everything that had once made it home. Korath and Venus had been very young back then, barely 100 years old, which was still childhood for their long-lived species. And they had been forced to watch as their parents froze to death, and then their brothers and sisters, and then everyone else they had ever known. "We survived because we are brothers," Korath said, looking at Venus with an expression of fierce protective love. "We refused to let each other go, and we kept each other warm through the endless winters, and we told each other that someday someone would come." Daniel did not know what to say, because what words could possibly be enough for that kind of loss and that kind of suffering? An entire civilization had been wiped out because the galaxy had decided they were not worth saving. And these 2 brothers had spent 300 years waiting for help that everyone else had assumed would never come. "I am taking you off this world," Daniel said finally, and his voice was firm with determination. "Both of you are coming with me, and I do not care what the Galactic Council has to say about it." Korath studied him for a long moment with those ancient amber eyes that had seen so much pain and loss. "Why would you help us when you owe us nothing and there is no benefit to you?" "Because someone should have helped you 300 years ago," Daniel replied, "and because I am here now and I can do something about it." Claire had been listening to the conversation while she monitored Venus' vital signs, and she wiped away a tear that had started rolling down her cheek. "We need to get them to the ship," she said. "The smaller one is stable for now, but he needs real medical treatment, not just blankets and heat packs." Daniel nodded, and he looked at Korath. "Can you walk if we help support you?" The dragon took a deep breath, and then he pushed himself up onto his feet. And this time, his legs held steady beneath him, even though Daniel could see how much effort it was taking. "I will walk," Korath said. "I have not survived 300 years to give up now." Together the 4 of them made their way out of the temple, with Daniel and Claire supporting Venus between them, while Korath walked alongside them, using the wall for balance when he needed it. The wind outside had grown even stronger, and the cold was brutal, but they pushed through it step by step, until they finally reached the distant horizon. As they climbed aboard the ship, and the warm air wrapped around them, Daniel saw something in Korath's eyes that he had not seen before. It was hope. After 3 centuries of darkness and despair, and waiting for death too, finally come the dragon was allowing himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Daniel made another silent promise to himself that he would not let that hope be wasted. These brothers had suffered enough, and it was time for someone to show them that the galaxy was not as cold and uncaring as they had been taught to believe. It was time for someone to remind them that kindness still existed among the stars. Getting 2 12-foot dragons onto a cargo ship that was designed for carrying crates and containers turned out to be one of the most difficult things Daniel had ever done in his life. Claire had to completely rearrange the entire cargo hold by pushing all of their legitimate shipments to one side and converting the remaining space into a makeshift medical area where the brothers could rest and receive treatment. The ship systems were not built for reptilian creatures, so they had to get creative with their solutions, and Daniel spent hours building heat lamps out of spare parts, while Claire mixed together nutrient solutions from whatever food supplies they had in the galley. Venus remained unconscious for 3 full days while the ship traveled through hyperspace toward the nearest station. And during that time, Korath barely left his brother's side. He would talk to Venus in their native language, which was full of deep rumbling sounds and clicking noises that Daniel could not understand, and he would press his head against his brother's head in a gesture that seemed to mean something important in their culture. On the morning of the fourth day, Venus finally opened his eyes. He looked around the interior of the ship with an expression of pure wonder, as if he could not believe what he was seeing, and his scales, which had been dull and faded when they first found him, had started to regain some of their natural shimmer. "I was dreaming of warmth," Venus said in a soft voice that was higher and gentler than his brother's. "I thought that I was finally dying and going to join our family." "You almost did die," Claire told him gently, while she checked his vital signs on the medical monitor. "Your body temperature had dropped so low that it is honestly a miracle your organs did not shut down completely." Venus turned to look at his brother, and the two of them pressed their foreheads together in that same gesture Daniel had seen before, and he realized now that it was their way of saying "I love you" without needing any words. Then Venus looked at Daniel and Claire with curiosity in his amber eyes. "You are the humans," he said, "the ones that the Galactic Council calls reckless and unpredictable and dangerous." Daniel smiled at that description. "Yes, that is us, and we are also apparently running an unlicensed dragon rescue operation, which I am sure the Council will have something to say about." "They will not be pleased," Koroth said, and there was worry in his voice. "We are their forgotten mistake, and they will not want evidence of their failure walking around the galaxy where everyone can see us." "Then we will have to make sure that you are impossible to ignore," Daniel replied. He had been thinking about this problem ever since they had left Velcris 7 behind, and he had come up with a plan that he thought might actually work. The Galactic Council operated on bureaucracy. Indifference, which meant that if something was not their problem, they simply did not deal with it, and they assumed everyone else would forget about it eventually. But humans had a different approach to these kinds of situations. Humans made noise and told stories, and turned forgotten tragedies into scandals that could not be swept under the rug, no matter how hard the powerful tried to make them disappear. Daniel opened a communication channel to his contacts in the Independent Journalist Network, which was a group of reporters and writers who specialized in exposing the things that the Council wanted to keep hidden. He told them everything about Velcris 7 and the Draconeth, and the two brothers who had survived 300 years of cold and isolation, while waiting for help that never came. By the time the distant horizon reached the nearest space station, the story had already started spreading across every newsfeed in the entire sector. People were talking about it in bars and restaurants and workplaces, and the more they talked, the angrier they became, because this was not just a sad story about some aliens dying on a frozen world. This was a story about the galaxy turning its back on an entire civilization because helping them was not convenient or profitable. Claire had been monitoring the news feeds, and she called Daniel over to show him something on her screen. "Look at this," she said with excitement in her voice. "There are protests forming outside council buildings on 6 different worlds, and more are being planned every day." Daniel read the headlines, and he felt something warm growing in his chest. Humans were demanding answers, and they were demanding accountability, and they were refusing to let this story be buried and forgotten, like the Draconeth themselves had almost been. Venus came to stand beside them, and he watched the news reports with an expression that Daniel could not quite. "Your people are strange," the dragon said finally. "You have no natural weapons, and no protective scales, and no fire breath, and yet you challenge the most powerful organization in the galaxy on behalf of 2 beings you have never met before." "That is just how humans are," Claire said with a shrug. "We get really angry when we see injustice, and we do not know how to mind our own business." "No," Venus said seriously. "It is more than that, because I have watched other species learn about tragedies and feel sad for a moment before moving on with their lives. But your people do not move on until something changes." He paused and looked at his brother, who had come to join them. You refuse to accept that some things cannot be fixed, and that is a remarkable quality that I've never seen before. Korath nodded in agreement. Perhaps the council was right to call your species dangerous, but not in the way they meant it, because you are dangerous to those who rely on silence and forgetfulness to escape the consequences of their actions. Daniel looked at the two brothers, and he felt proud of his species in a way he had not felt in a very long time. Humans were not perfect, and they had done plenty of terrible things throughout their history. But they also had this stubborn refusal to look away from suffering, and this burning need to make things right, even when it was difficult. And right now, that stubbornness was going to save two dragons who had been abandoned by everyone else in the galaxy. Come on, Daniel said. We have a station to dock at and a lot of people who want to meet you. The brothers looked at each other and then back at Daniel, and for the first time since he had found them in that frozen temple, he saw them smile. The response to the story of the twin dragon brothers was exactly what Daniel had hoped for, and exactly what the Galactic Council had feared. Humans across dozens of worlds were outraged when they learned about what had happened on Velcris 7, and the story of the Draconeth dying in the cold while the galaxy looked away struck something deep in the human heart that could not be ignored. Within a few weeks, there were massive protests outside council buildings on more than 20 different planets, and the crowds kept growing larger every single day. People carried signs with pictures of Korath and Venus, and they chanted slogans demanding justice for the forgotten species, and they refused to go home until the council addressed what had happened. Independent ships began making their own trips to Velcris 7, searching through the frozen ruins for any other survivors, and documenting everything they found so that the Draconeth civilization would not be completely erased from history. Journalists wrote long articles about the culture and art and science that the Draconeth had created before the cold came and destroyed everything, and people read these articles and wept for all that had been lost. Korath and Venus became symbols of something larger than themselves, and their faces appeared on news screens all across the galaxy, as living proof that the council indifference had real and terrible consequences. We did not ask for any of this, Korath told Daniel one evening as they sat together in the common area of the space station where they had been staying. We did not want to become icons for your movement. I know, Daniel said, but your people deserve to be remembered, and the council needs to be held accountable for what they did. Accountability. Korath repeated the word slowly, as if he was tasting it for the first time. In 300 years of waiting and hoping and slowly dying, we learned that such things do not exist for those who hold power. They exist now, Daniel replied firmly, because humans are stubborn enough to demand them. Venus had recovered completely by this point, and his scales had regained all of their beautiful shimmer, and his eyes were bright with health and energy that had been missing when they first found him. He spent most of his time with Claire, learning about human culture and technology, and asking endless questions about everything from music to medicine to the strange foods that humans like to eat. Your species creates art that serves no practical purpose, he said to her one afternoon, while they watched a human musician perform on a screen. You build things just because they are beautiful, and you tell stories just because they make you feel emotions. Claire laughed at his confusion. Is that strange to you? It is wonderful, Venus said. The Draconeth created art as well, but we always believed we were unusual among the species of the galaxy, and now I see that humans share this quality with us. He paused, and his expression became more serious. Perhaps that is why your people care so much about what happened to us. You understand what it means to lose beautiful things. The Galactic Council tried everything they could think of to make the story go away, but nothing worked, because every time they issued a statement denying responsibility, the humans would respond with more evidence and more witnesses and more demands. Finally, After months of pressure, the Council was forced to issue a formal apology for the abandonment of Velcris 7 and the complete failure to help the Draconeth people when they needed it most. Along with the apology came reparations, which were large sums of money that would be used to preserve what remained of Draconeth culture and to build a memorial on the frozen world where so many had died. "It is not enough," Korath said when he heard the news. "Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what was lost." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it is a start, and more importantly, it sets a precedent that will affect how the Council treats other species." And he was right, because the scandal of Velcris 7 changed things across the entire galaxy in ways that nobody had expected. Other forgotten species began coming forward to tell their own stories of being abandoned and ignored by the Council, and humans took up their causes with the same fierce determination they had shown for the Dragon Brothers. New laws were proposed and debated, and eventually passed, that required the Council to respond to distress calls from any inhabited world, regardless of whether that world was a member of the galactic government. Relief organizations were created to provide aid to planets in crisis, and humans volunteered in huge numbers to staff these organizations and travel to distant worlds where help was needed. "You have changed everything," Venus said to Daniel one day as they watched a news report about a rescue mission to another forgotten world. A single human found 2 dying dragons in the ice, and now the entire galaxy is different. Daniel shook his head. "I just did what anyone should have done, and it was other people who took that small act and turned it into something larger." "But someone had to be first," Venus insisted. "Someone had to show that it was possible to care about strangers and to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, and you were that someone." Korath joined them, and he placed one massive clawed hand on Daniel's shoulder in a gesture that felt almost fatherly. "You have given us more than our lives," the older dragon said. "You have given us hope that the universe is not as cold and cruel as we believed it to be." Daniel looked at the 2 brothers who had become like family to him over these past months, and he felt tears forming in his eyes. "That is what humans do," he said quietly. "We remind each other that things can get better, even when everything seems hopeless." And standing there with the Dragon Brothers, he believed those words more than he ever had before. 1 year after Daniel Shaw found them dying in the ice on Velcris 7, the twin Dragon Brothers, Korath and Venus, stood before an assembly of hundreds of human and alien dignitaries on a brand new space station called Unity. The station was the newest and most ambitious project ever undertaken by humanity and its allies, and it was designed to be a place where species from all across the galaxy could come together to meet and trade and build something meaningful as partners. The dragons had been invited to speak at the station grand opening ceremony because their story had become a symbol of what the galaxy could accomplish when it chose compassion and cooperation over convenience and indifference. Korath stepped forward to the speaking platform, and his amber eyes surveyed the crowd of beings who had gathered to hear his words, and he stood tall and proud, with his scales shimmering under the station lights. 300 years ago, he began, in his deep rumbling, "My people sent messages to every corner of the galaxy begging for someone to help us survive the cold that was killing our world." He paused to let those words sink into the minds of everyone listening. "The galaxy answered us with silence, and we believed that we had been completely forgotten by all the beings who lived among the stars. And we thought that we would die alone, without anyone ever knowing or caring that we had existed." The crowd was utterly silent as Korath continued speaking. "We were wrong, because we had not been forgotten by everyone. And one small ship answered our call, not because its pilot was ordered to come, and not because there was any profit in saving us, but simply because he believed that no one should have to die alone in the cold." Korath turned to look at Daniel, who was standing at the back of the great chamber with Claire beside him. "One human taught us that the galaxy is not as empty and heartless as we had come to believe. Venus stepped up beside his brother, so that their shoulders were touching in that gesture of unity and love that had sustained them through 3 centuries of darkness and despair. "We are the last of the Draconeth," Venus said, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber. "Our species will end with us, and that loss can never be undone, no matter how many apologies are given or how much money is paid in reparations." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was stronger. "But we are not the end of our story, because the humans who found us and fought for us and refused to let our people be erased from memory have given us something more precious than survival. They have given us a future," Korath continued. "Not as a species, perhaps, but as brothers and survivors, and living proof that kindness can survive even the coldest and longest night." The crowd erupted into applause that seemed to shake the very walls of the station. Claire squeezed his hand as they watched the 2 dragons receive the recognition they deserved. After the ceremony was over, Korath found Daniel near the observation deck, where he had gone to be alone with his thoughts and to watch the stars drift by outside the massive windows. "You gave us everything," the dragon said, as he came to stand beside the human. "How can we ever repay such a debt?" Daniel shook his head. "It is not a debt, because that is not how I think about what I did, and it is not how you should think about it either." "Then, what is it?" "It is just what you do when you find someone who needs help," Daniel said. "You help them, and you do not ask for anything in return." "The human way," Korath said, and there was something like wonder in his voice. "Yeah," Daniel replied with a small smile, "the human way." Korath was quiet for a moment as he considered those words, and then he spoke again. "Venus and I have been talking about what comes next. We should do with the years we have remaining to us, and we have made a decision." "What kind of decision?" "We are going to spend our lives making sure that no other species is ever forgotten the way ours was," Korath said. "We are going to search the dark and abandoned places of the galaxy and look in the forgotten corners where no one else bothers to go." His amber eyes met Daniel's eyes directly. "And when we find beings who have been left behind and given up on, we are going to be the ones who answer their calls for help." Daniel felt his heart swell with emotion as he understood what the dragon was saying. "That sounds like a big mission for just 2 dragons," he said. Korath's mouth curved into something that looked very much like a smile. "Then perhaps we will need a ship and a crew who are foolish enough to join us on this journey." Claire appeared at Daniel's shoulder, having apparently been listening to the conversation from nearby. "Distant Horizon could probably use some upgrades," she said. "And I have always wanted to do something that actually mattered with my life." Daniel looked at the 2 dragons, who had become his closest friends, and then at Claire, who had been by his side through everything, and then out at the vast, endless expanse of stars beyond the station windows. Somewhere out there, other species were dying in the cold and crying out for help that they believed would never come, just like the Draconeth had once believed. Unless someone went looking for them, unless someone decided that their lives mattered enough to take a risk and fly into the unknown and offer a hand to those who had been abandoned by everyone else. "All right," Daniel said, and he felt a grin spreading across his face. "Let us go find them." Korath and Venus looked at each other, and then back at Daniel, and in their ancient amber eyes he could see the same fierce determination that had kept them alive through 300 years of waiting. They were not just survivors anymore. They were rescuers, and they were going to make sure that no one else had to wait as long as they had waited for someone to care. The 4 of them walked together toward the docking bay, where the distant horizon was waiting. And as they walked, Daniel thought about all the beings out there in the darkness who had given up hope. He thought about how it would feel to be the one who showed up when everyone else had stopped coming, and how it would feel to tell someone that they had not been forgotten after all. and he knew that this was exactly what he was meant to do with his life. The galaxy was vast and cold, and full of beings who needed help, and Daniel Shaw was going to find as many of them as he could, one forgotten world at a time, one desperate cry for help at a time, one small act of kindness at a time, because that was the human way. Dragon Way too, and together they were going to change the galaxy forever.